Well, hello and welcome to the 8th video in this beginner's guide to After Effects. In this particular tutorial, we're going to take a closer look at keyframes. So in this video, we're going to be covering the following topics: keyframes, as well as keyframe easing. So in other words, after this video, you're going to have a much deeper understanding about how keyframes work and how you can put them to good use. And that way you're going to feel a whole lot more comfortable with it as you go forward. So let's get into it. All right, so here I find myself in After Effects once again, and I have a project open here, and I'll demonstrate two simple animation sequences. So here I have two simple rectangle animations from left to right. And as they move, they also change size as well as opacity. Also, notice that even though they are the same animation, they do move differently. But don't worry about that for now. I just wanted to point that out. So for now, if we look at the timeline panel, we can see that this composition is 3 seconds long, and we are currently in preview mode. We can see the red line going across the timeline to the end and then starting again in repetition. Also in the timeline panel, we can see the layers that make up this composition. And here we have a two-shape layer and a background composition. Now under each shape layer, we can see some small shapes. So these shapes are what we call keyframes in After Effects. So these keyframes are determining the animation sequence that we see above in the visual composition panel. For now, I'll just press the space bar on the keyboard to stop the preview, and I'll drag the time indicator back to the start. So, what are keyframes? Well, keyframes are tools that are used in After Effects as a way to set parameters for all effects over time. So notice over here on the left, we can see keyframes for both these layers, and they're adjacent to the position, scale, and opacity properties, right? Now, in the last episode, you saw that I only had one animation principle applied to each shape layer. Here, we've got 3 animation principles applied to each layer. So when animating a layer, element keyframes are set for each property individually. And then we see these stacked on top of each other. So to these layers, we position keyframes. Then under this, we have the scale keyframes. And under this, we have the opacity keyframes. So again, if we look carefully, we can see that for each property, a keyframe is placed to start the sequence at the particular point in the timeline. And another keyframe is placed to the end of where we want that animation to stop in the sequence. So keyframe marks the point in time where you specify a value for a particular property. So at this stage, it may help you to think of keyframes as journey points. Basic animations have a start point and an end point, right? And it's a journey in between. Whereas more complex sequences will have a start, a middle, and an end point. For example, on this shape layer 1, we have the position keyframes, and then under this, we have the scale keyframes, and then under this, we have the opacity keyframes. So just notice that the start and the end keyframes are different for each property, as each property is animated at a different time in the sequence. So if I now come over here to the blue time indicator at the top of the timeline panel and just slowly click and drag it from left to right, starting from the first position keyframe along to the next keyframe, we can see the red triangle moves from the left-hand side of the screen to the right. So the first keyframe is the starting point, point A, let's just call it, and the second keyframe is the midpoint, point B. And just like that, it's how keyframes work in After Effects. So We create a keyframe with a particular value for a particular effect at one particular point, and then set a keyframe at another point with a different value, and then After Effects fills in the gaps for us. Just so you know, it's called keyframe interpolation, and this is where After Effects creates the frames between the points, so we don't have to animate everything frame by frame. For example, here we only have 2 keyframes to get from point A to point B, and then After Effects will fill in the gaps between, just interpolating the frames in between, moving the rectangle across, right? Now, if we look further along the timeline, we can see there is a 3rd keyframe, and if I continue to drag my timeline indicator further, we can see the red rectangle travels back to the start. In other words, back to point A. But in the context of keyframes, this is the end point. So point A is the start, point B is the middle, and back to point A is the end. Make sense? So I'll tell you that in this instance, the first keyframe places the rectangle at point A. The 3rd keyframe also places the rectangle at point A. So these 2 keyframes have the same keyframe property applied, equaling the same position visually in the composition panel. So because the animation sequence endpoint is the same as the start point, when we preview this, and I'll just drag the time indicator to the start point and press spacebar, so it looks like an infinite animation loop, right? So that is the position sequence. So now I'll press a spacebar to stop the preview and drag my time indicator back to the start. Now, on the same shape layer 1, we also have keyframes for scale and opacity. We can also see that there are more applied this time than there were applied in the position. So why don't we just have a closer look? So if we drag the time indicator from the first keyframe to the second, we can see that when we arrive at the second keyframe, we are at the midway point between point A and point B, and the size and the opacity of the rectangle has changed. Right, so these keyframes here are setting the properties for the scale and opacity of the rectangle at this point in time. So from the start to this point, the rectangle gets smaller and changes opacity. Now, if I continue to drag my time indicator right to point B, we can see the size and opacity are back to the starting point that it was when it was back at the starting point of point A. And we have these keyframes here on the layer that specify that. So from the midway point between point A and B, the rectangle gets larger and changes opacity back. So between the start keyframe and the middle keyframes for the position, we have these keyframes here for scale and opacity, which also animate in between. Now, if I were to continue to drag the time indicator to the right, we can see that the next set of keyframes for scale and opacity are the same as the previous at the midway point between point A and B. And if we continue to move along to the end of the sequence, it appears as it was in the beginning. So in this instance, for scale and opacity, we have the starting keyframe, the end keyframe, and the middle keyframes in between. So a start, a middle, and an end. So now you see an overview of how keyframes are used and how they can be set for various parameters to create an animation sequence. It's pretty cool, huh? Now, up until this point, we have been focusing on the red triangle. Now, if I were to drag my time indicator back to the start and press the spacebar to preview, we can see the yellow triangle below is the same animation, but it appears to move differently. So this yellow rectangle is animating smoothly, where the red rectangle, in comparison, appears to move more rigidly. So now if we look at the timeline panel, we can see that the keyframes for the yellow rectangle are positioned exactly the same as the red. So what's going on here? Why is it looking more smooth? Well, in After Effects, we can apply what's called easing to our keyframes. So you might be thinking, okay, well, why are you keeping it a secret? Tell me about this easing stuff. Well, in After Effects, we can apply easing to our keyframes to apply a smoother animation effect. So if we look in the timeline panel and compare the keyframe shapes between the red and the yellow rectangle, we can actually see a difference, right? So in this instance, easing has been applied to all the keyframes on the yellow rectangle sequence, but not on the red rectangle. The default keyframes applied to the red rectangle are all diamond shape. And we can see each keyframe on the red rectangle looks exactly the same. Whereas the keyframes on the yellow rectangle, these look slightly different. Now, if I come into the timeline panel and carefully click just before the first position keyframe on the red rectangle, click and then drag over all the other keyframes for the red rectangle animation. When I release it, I'll be able to select them all, and they will be highlighted in blue. And now if I carefully come over to the left at the top of the timeline panel, the layer names, you see how there's an icon here called Graph Editor. So if I click on this, where the layers once were, we will now see this visual diagram. So what we're looking at here is the momentum of the red rectangle shape between each keyframe, and it's represented here by red squares. So here we have the momentum of position, opacity, and scale. Now notice how straight the lines are at each point with hard edges at each keyframe. So let me just click back on the Graph Editor button and go back to my layers. This time I'll do the same thing, but for the yellow rectangle keyframes. So if I come just under the yellow rectangle layer here and carefully click just before the first position keyframe and drag over all the other keyframes for the yellow rectangle, when I release it, that'll select all of them and they will be highlighted in blue. So if I come back to the Graph Editor button at the top of the timeline panel above, click on the layer name, and now we're seeing a very different diagram. Instead of the rigid lines and hard corners that we saw in the red rectangle sequence, we're now seeing these nice smooth lines between each keyframe. So this is exactly what easing does in After Effects. In principle, easing adds smooth momentum between keyframe points, which in turn adds smoothness to the appearance of our sequences. For now, I'm just going to click back on the Graph Editor to return back to the layers, drag my time indicator back to the start, and press the space bar. And that'll show me a preview, and we can see the effect easing has when it's applied to keyframes. All right, so that looks pretty obvious, I should think. So let me just recap those key things to remember. Our keyframes are set for each property separately on each layer, and animation or effect sequence. These will always begin with a keyframe to start and end with a keyframe to finish whatever effect or whatever you're doing. And keyframe easing can be added to apply smoothness in these sequences. All right, my friends, why don't we take a short break here, and in the next video, we're going to start with one of the most basic tasks in After Effects. Now it's getting more clear. I'll see you then.